So I have the pleasure this morning of introducing our first speaker, but I also have the pleasure of introducing to you our newest board member for California ReLeaf. Jose will be at his first board meeting tomorrow, so a round of applause. When we introduced ourselves, Jose did. But we're considering you. So Jose is an experienced educator in formal and informal education settings. Most recently, he's been in Washington, D.C., trying to build bridges with advocacy and conservation with the Latino community. And I think it's really great to have you with us today. So, God, congratulations and welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. I hope I got this the right one. So I'll do my best to stay with the microphone. I usually like to move around, but this will work well. Good. Yeah, perfect. So first of all, it's a treat to be here, and I'm hoping what we will be. There you go. I'm hoping what we're going to be able to talk about should all weave together, and just to connect to the work that Bobby presented on yesterday, that idea of thinking about your audience, messaging, but I'm going to stick to that term that he talked about, bridging. So think about how your work bridges with the communities, because that's really what you're doing in terms of what you care about and the messaging with what the communities you work with and more communities you want to work with, what they care about and what's important to them. And to speak to what Cindy presented, if you feel a little uncomfortable, that's okay. I mean, that's learning, right? That's learning in general about engaging in a new experience, and want you to know that it should connect to what you're doing. So the important piece is just keep that in mind, okay? And that questions come up, and that's a good thing. So to connect to another piece from Bobby's yesterday is we really want to avoid the arrogance of expertise, so that you feel like, well, either I already know it, or is it important for me to know? It's really about being open to this work. So thank you for Bobby and Cindy. We want to continue to bridge with a lot of this work and presentations. So what we're going to be talking about today is some of the work that I've been doing as an individual, and the work that we're trying to set up as Latino Outdoors, and that we've been setting up over the past year, and how those have been learning opportunities and successes to share with you. And especially about thinking about the power of storytelling. So you should be hearing that a lot. Many of your organizations do a great job with storytelling. So we want to really unpack that as to what does that look like then when you're basically going to be engaging more diverse communities, right? And so unpack your story, seek to understand and be open to the stories of the communities, and again, find those opportunities for connect and the bridging. So one of those examples really comes from the individual. And for you to also be comfortable and understand what's your story and what are the stories of the individuals in the community. For our work in Latino Outdoors, we like to identify what I refer to as ambicultural leaders. So you might be familiar with the term bicultural, meaning that I have two cultures. But I like to use the term ambicultural because just ambidextrous means you can use both hands. So to be ambiculturous, I want to support individuals that can use both cultures, if not more. And so then that means how I represent that is that I am a first-generation immigrant from Mexico. So I was born in Mexico, came over at the age of 9 with my parents, and grew up in the Central Valley. So I'm also the first in my family to go to college. I was an English language learner. I'm the oldest of 9. So that lived and shared experience resonates as a story with a lot of the communities that we work with, right? It's easy to relate and identify. At the same time, I love the outdoors, and I'm passionate about conservation and how to diversify the conservation movement. So I love going out on a hike and talk about ecosystem services, right? I do get excited about carbon sequestration, right? So it's about leveraging both of those cultures, and when I'm out with communities is to be able to, use both of those identities so that we can support communities basically in what they need, even if what we're doing is we're going out on a hike, right? So these are some of the examples in terms of how I connect with the outdoors, and then I try to connect that passion with the communities that we work with. And it's just, you can never beat adorable pictures of adorable kids, right, enjoying nature in the outdoors. And I'll come back to this picture at the end, because when we talk about storytelling, and especially as an entry point to topics such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, that requires a lot of work. And that can be very uncomfortable for a lot of people, and especially if you haven't had a really good experience going through that process, it's even more uncomfortable, right? But I'm putting this picture because I want to stress that that's work for everybody. So regardless of your background, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, we all have work to do in this field. And I'll come back to this picture to represent how even I myself, recognizing the privileges that I have as a Latino male, and even the privileges that I have with my story and my lived experience, what is the work that, how do I need to represent that for members of my own community, whether that community is outdoor enthusiasts, a very, as you can see, very diverse set of outdoor enthusiasts, but also within my community of different Latino communities, and also just working with diverse allies. So that's where we talk about avoid the arrogance of expertise. In other words, I don't come here telling you I'm doing it all right, and I can do no wrong, so just listen to me. It's more about this is the learning process that we've gone through. We have an opportunity to learn forward together. Okay? So I'm taking that line from Bill McKibben, who said, I want to learn forward. And so I told him, well, let's learn forward together, because then that's even going to make it stronger. So we use the idea of story because we're surrounded by stories. Whether you're aware of it or not, we are. And so those powerful narratives get to shape and influence how we interact with each other or see each other and what we say. And especially in the area of nature, outdoors, and conservation, once you start digging a little deeper, you kind of see which stories get highlighted, amplified, and which ones get left out. So to give you a simple example is in the National Park Service, especially with the historic trail system, the De Anza Trail. Now, how many of you, show of hands, know about the De Anza Trail or where it is or anything? So a few, right? And so that trail tells many stories, but one of the most striking ones is that in 1776, so when we talk about the foundation of the US and we connect 1776, stories should start coming into your mind. People, right? Things from class, from history. And you're thinking, oh, the 13 colonies, the American Revolution, it's the foundation of the US. That is a story. It's a story that begins from east to west and of particular communities moving from east to west. At the same time, however, you have in 1776 dozens of families, Afro-Latinos, mestizos, so black and brown people, coming for better economic opportunities from Mexico up into California. That's a story of over 200 years ago that's very similar to a lot of the stories of communities today, right? And to connect that to places in California that have names like Atascadero, or Paso Robles, or Palo Alto, right? It shows the roots of connecting to the ecology of California from these economic migrants, right? But how that story gets shared and framed and told is depending on the storytellers. So this is why a lot of the work that's being done now with the De Anza Trail is about bringing that story back, rather than in how it connects to communities today and how it's a live story, rather than something that just happened 200 years ago and no longer has any relevance, right? And even more importantly, that it tells a complementary migration story or story of the foundation of the US that's not coming just from east to west. And why this matters, of course, that Cindy and others have pointed out, California is kind of your case study for this about why the demographics are here and why they matter. And so to connect that to the idea of story is, this was certified actually this year by the US Census that now Latinos are the plurality in California, the largest demographic block or group. But that idea of story still resonates, right? So great. So if we have this number, this reality, what does that mean? And what's the story behind it? So if I take a quote like this, or an example, this is storytelling right here in media. And what is either incomplete or inaccurate about that? Or is anything? I don't know, you can tell me, it looks fine. 2 years old? Right? Right? Exactly. That is correct. What did I just tell you about the Dianza expedition? And so how does that influence what the demographics are? And it's complex. Like I said, this isn't about that just mestizos and Afro-Latinos founded California. Obviously, there were communities here, and there's a whole identity to unpack around being Latino, or being colonizer and colonized. But it still points to the fact that when California was founded as a modern state, it was predominantly Latino, right? You had extensive Californio communities here. What happened to them, we can talk about that later, because that's a different story. So it's to be able to say surpassing whites for the first time is to say actually not the first time, at least 2, if not 3 times. But you have to then pay attention about then this story then frames Latinos as a new community again, which is a narrative that you have to pay attention to. There's a newness, and so if you're new, then what does that say about the approaches to this community? Well, maybe you just need to be better educated. Maybe you don't know. Maybe you don't have a history or connection to these places or to this work. And so it's about understanding that, because you'll see this be present in a lot of popular media, right? So Latinos then get blocked off as an immigrant community. And then you ignore a lot of the history that's already happened. So I think I saw a hand waving.
I don't want to detract from your point, but I want everybody to know when we're visiting Riverside, we have a statue of Dianza, and he went right through Riverside. And we can show you the arroyo across it.
Bam, right there. No, it's great. And I'll quickly loop this back because, like I said, when it becomes an uncomfortable topic, you have to understand that because these stories, they are received by communities. And so this is very relevant and present, as we were just talking about Ferguson, the work of Black Lives Matters. That does not exist in its own space, separate from conservation work, separate from nature and the outdoors. Because in those experiences, and a lot of the work that you do, you know this when you go into community and you think, like, how does this connect, and is it relevant, right? How do we make trees matter to communities where they're staying? What about all these other things that matter, and how are you going to help us with that? An example for us is if we have a community that doesn't have a great experience with law enforcement, to have them go out camping and understand, well, what's going to be the law enforcement experience out there? Is it going to be similar, different? How are we helping facilitate that? And to be aware of it, because you may not have that experience. You're like, camping is fantastic. I've never had a ranger come up to me and make me feel unwelcome, right? But some of these communities have. And to shoot you a few more quick examples about connecting what we call a nature or outdoor conservation story to a story of other communities. I think many of you have seen this before. What is this a migration map of? Monarchs. And how do you know it's the monarchs? Yeah. And for a lot of ecologists or even just naturalists, this is an easy map to recognize. Even when I see this, I immediately think monarchs. Because I think it's like, I know where they are, I know where they migrate. But that's a story that you're also very familiar with. You know, President has declared Pollinator Week. We need to save the monarchs. We need to plant more milkweed. They're really important. That story is there as a sense of urgency, right? We need to do something about this. This matters a lot. Connected to another migration map. And what is this a migration map of? You can shout it out. Yeah, farm workers. Now this, we We can have a lot of documentation of the monarch migration maps. I can find a lot of those. But to find a migrant farm worker migration map, not as common. Right? This is one organization that's helping map this. But, and even though as we have, there has been a reduction in terms of migration of farm workers for a bunch of other reasons, this still matters and this still happens. And so the question is, okay, so we have 2 stories of migration. How do you connect and understand this migration story in a sense of any urgency or importance or matter? Right? I think we're doing a lot better, especially around the work of pesticides and heat and other issues. But I point this out because when you see then images like this, it isn't always totally random. Or like I say, it isn't just because the monarch is pretty, so you're going to see it in some of these events or rallies. It's because there is some experience or connection that you can be open to and explore. So this is why we have, social media tag right here. All these butterflies remind me of a childhood in Michoacan. Beautiful, right? And so same thing for me growing up as a kid. I remember the monarchs in Mexico, right? And so that idea of migration does resonate with communities. And we've seen other organizations do this really well with birds as well, connecting bird migration to migration of people. And so that's one of the driving questions I want you to think about. And this should resonate with what Bobby was mentioning yesterday. What story are we telling? If you can unpack that, then that's an entry point to think about any biases, assumptions, and what can you do with that. So let me ask you real quickly. I'm going to just do a quick 30-second shot. I want you in your table, just turn to your partner or in their table and see if you can quickly just kind of like lightning round. If I were to ask you, what is the Latino story? What comes to mind? Okay. So, turn and talk. What is the Latino story? So we're in workshop mode, so I wish we could have more time to unpack and talk about this. But what are some of the things that came up in terms of when I asked you that question, what is the Latino story? Mm-hmm. What's that? Yes, so the Latino story is diverse. Great. What else? Mm-hmm. That the Latinos took back California without going to war? Yeah? Yes. What is, when I ask what is the Latino story? Mm-hmm. There you go. So the story of the missions, for example, in the founding of California? Great. Bobby? Right, exactly. So the diversity of the multiple stories, great. So I'll do one more.
So my partner had a story about a hardworking family who came
There you go. So some of that economic success, right, or the transitions that a lot of families work towards, and having their kids be the first ones to go to college. So I mean, I fit part of that story. So perfect. I think definitely if you're already in the frame and thinking obviously that there's that diversity of stories, you're off at the right start, right? And it's important to then look at then when stories are in popular media, for example, or in print or other work, to think about that. Is this helping us understand the diversity of the Latino experience and stories? And even if we just look at the migration story, to look at what does migration look like for the community. Migration is different from, from communities from Mexico, from communities from Central America, from communities from Cuba, from communities from South America. That migration experience in itself is different, right? Why did you migrate, and how long ago, and how recent, and what has that done for your community, okay? And to ask and find out, and there's individuals that are here to help you. But to give you a quick example about that is, if you migrated from Oaxaca in Mexico, it's different because of economic pressures at home. It's different than if you migrated from El Salvador in the 80s because of civil war, right? But migration is still part of that, and what does it mean to establish a new home? And so this is where we push you into, when I asked you, who are the characters and who are the storytellers? Where do you get these stories from? How are you present in the communities where you're hearing these stories? Is it predominantly coming from media? And then who are those individuals that are framing that story? And how are you going to be a storyteller in this work as well? So that when we have individuals, even for us with Latino Outdoors, we see then this, what I call ambicultural leadership, or this work to try to represent, but also deal with these multiple identities. And so when I have someone like Chicano in the Wilderness here, he's from Sacramento. He's an educator, artist. He's just coming back from a 30-day Knowles expedition out in the Yukon, right? But he wasn't born kind of an outdoor enthusiast. He connected to this because of his students. He's a teacher. And one of his students really, got into this and got a scholarship. So for him, it's important to support the student, because that's part of the story in the community. As a Chicano teacher, you help your kids succeed no matter what, because of the lived experience in that community. So it just happens that one of the ways that this is now playing out is through outdoor education and through the outdoors. Okay? But he takes his identity and frames it in this way by calling himself Chicano in the Wilderness. And then so we can unpack that to see why does that matter, what does it mean? But more importantly is then the community in which he is now, they trust them, they get excited about what he's doing, so he has that ambicultural leadership that the community can resonate with. And so we see the same with some of the individuals that we work with. Chasqui Mom, who's amazing, and she uses Chasqui because the Chasquis were the Inca runners. So they were the runners of the Inca Empire. So that's really important to her. But she's an REI fanatic, right? They have a brand new baby, a new baby, 6 months old, and the baby already has 6 REI hiking pants, right? So she doesn't need to be sold on the excitement and value of the outdoors. But you can connect and support that while understanding why culture is really important to her in this work. And so we see this represented in these individuals who can help with the work that we do, because they very proudly want to share the stories of their communities, whether it's Chicano, whether it's Peruvian, whether it's, that's what we're saying, what is the diversity of the Latino identity? We have the diversity in these individuals, and how are they connected to the diversity of outdoor and nature experiences, right? Whether it's introductory family hiking, to wilderness skills, right? So Eco Chicano here, he's actually from LA. Then he started working with with indigenous and migrant youth up in Yakima. Okay? And now he's doing more work over in Santa Cruz. So we extend that to the heritage and culture of all of our communities. And this is why when you see this work, when you see this, it's an opportunity for you to better understand. And it's not to challenge what you're doing in a way that you feel like, well, we're just doing it wrong, or are we just not supposed to be engaging in this? The answer is no. Everyone has a role to play, right? Everyone has a role to play. And because we all come with different stories, and the idea is to weave these stories together to be a more representative and stronger weave. Okay? And you know this in principle. How it gets done, this is what we try to unpack through storytelling. So if you're unfamiliar with the work of Carolyn Finney, for example, Black Faces and White Spaces, has anyone not seen that book? No? Okay, well, you can write that down and say, I'm going to go check it out. This is important not just because of the story she tells, but the fact that it's done in a narrative structure. That is important in itself, rather than just, here's another academic study, right? Because it's meant to be engaging to more communities, and they can see themselves represented in this narrative. So the work that's being done with Carolyn Finney, obviously the work of Outdoor Afro as well, it's digging out deeper storytelling in that community as well. And so this is where we ask you to consider, A, do you know where do the narratives come from for different communities in terms of their relationship with nature, the outdoors, and conservation? So for Native Americans, that in itself, it's a diverse community and diverse stories. Asian Americans, that in itself, same thing. So African Americans and Latinos as well. There's diversity there. And so that means it's actually a lot of opportunities to engage rather than thinking, it's too hard. And so we see how this is shaped out by looking at how the story has been shifting for Native American communities in California. You know this, right? The idea that they had a passive engagement with nature, and that stereotype of the noble savage, right? In contrast to the active stewardship of these ecological spaces. And even when we look at fires, right? So when we look back in history and see how they use fire as an active management tool in the way that now we kind of need to look at it and understand it in the same way. And so that's a slightly different story. And even with trees in national forests, you know how that story changed from fire suppression to now really think about more active management. When you have Native American communities who kind of have been there and known that. But that doesn't mean their stories were supported or that their stories were understood in doing this. But then that matters now when you engage Native American communities in forest management and how their relationship with trees is and can be slightly different than our relationship with trees. So, speaking of, this is one of, it's a favorite, I know, graph for many people. This actually comes from the work of Charles Thomas, who's with the National Park Service, and it's from work by Edwin Nichols, who looks at some kind of cultural relevancy work. I want to stress, though, because we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, it's a starting point for you to understand, not a classification system for communities. Okay? That's when we're talking about how you have to examine your perspective. Because when we deal with questions of like, oh, well, Latinos, they don't care about nature, right? Or how do Latinos care about nature? And then you hear an example and think, oh, well, okay, great. Latinos just need more picnic tables at parks and we're good, right? Or I want to make sure the signs are in Spanish. Right? No, that's what I mean about, it's a starting point. You know that there's a value in social experiences for Latino communities in parks, but then how do you extend beyond that? Because you might be surprised, or you shouldn't be surprised, that Latino communities, for example, value stewardship just as much as their communities. Now, are they in the same connecting point as you are? Maybe not. And this is what I mean about examining then, well, what's the gap? Because maybe they're not out there every day helping you pick up litter because they have other economic issues happening, But once you work with them to deal with those, you'll find out they're just as engaged and interested in the stewardship of that, that space. But it takes time, and it takes relationship building, and it takes patience, and it takes understanding. And that's the part that's hard, and that's difficult for a lot of people. Because you think, where's my easy entry point? Let's go, let's do it. I have all the trash bags, I provided food, and the bus is ready to go. And then it doesn't work out, and then you feel disappointed. But we try again. And so the idea here is for you to kind of think about where your perspective about nature is coming from, and understand that, there's value in all of these. The Eurocentric type of kind of looking at nature and the outdoors is driven a lot by the scientific method, and especially coming from Renaissance and the Enlightenment, that tells us that there's this human-object relationship between me and that tree. I look at that tree and I classify it, count it, give me the species name. I can, basically count it and measure it. Is there value to that? Of course. We need that. This is what I mean about it isn't about when, what you're doing is wrong or incorrect. It's just we're saying there's other approaches to add to that and consider. So when we look at some indigenous communities and understand that there's more of a multiverse relationship and understanding with that tree or other wildlife spaces, that has value. And that is, how does that change when now this tree is seen as a member of the community, just as a family member? If your initial reaction is to think, well, that's silly. I mean, it's not a family member. We just need to know about the tree to take care of it. That's where we're asking you to push past that and seek to understand and ask and be open to that. Because now you understand how a community can treat a tree differently, or why that engagement might be lost if the story that has been pushed on them is the tree is just an object, or it can only be seen valued in X, Y, and Z ways instead of also A, B, and C. But once you help bridge those connections, powerful and magic stuff happens. Okay? And of course, the challenge with Latinos is that they fit all across this board, right? And we can come back to these. But no surprise is that culture has always played a role in defining and creating environmental or eco-knowledge. Okay? It's about then kind of packing it out and saying, well, what does that look like? So first understand, see if you can identify what those cultural connection points are. Ask a lot of questions. I know a lot of you do this well. You try to say, first, this is what I do for myself. I acknowledge I have biases. Regardless, that's a human condition. How do those biases influence my presumptions or assumptions about things? Okay, and I acknowledge those, but then I want to ask so that my assumptions can be corrected, challenged, or that I know how to continue the conversation. Rather than, I already know what I know, and I just need to convince you because I know I'm right. Okay? That does not open the pathway to conversation, because you need to connect. Okay. And the last piece is, we're really stressing story, even though knowing that there's still a cultural bias against story. Oh, that's just a story, and it's just an anecdote. What we really need is data, because data is what's going to convince people. And if you remember from Bobby's presentation yesterday, what are statistics? Statistics make what? Right? I get it, 90%, da-da-da. What does that look like for me? What does that look like in terms of the work in our communities? Because guess what? Stories are a natural information tool in communities. Oye, comadre, ¿escuchó? Right? Asking the neighbor, did you hear that this, and this, and this, and this? The word gets out about something through stories. And no surprise, this is the same thing since humans had the first campfire. Stories are a powerful platform for influence and connecting with each other. So this gets us as to using stories to build on this sense of community, because how you frame it, no surprise, validates and affirms an experience. It basically allows a community to say, we matter too. And that's why a lot of the work that I do is framed around yo cuento. So Spanish speakers, what does yo cuento mean? What's that? My story. And? I ask. I count, right? Exactly. So the Spanish term actually has this beautiful, double meaning in terms of yo cuento means I am telling you a story. Cuento is story, but cuento also means count. So it's also a way to say I matter. So when I say yo cuento, we use it as a way to frame that we matter, I matter through the stories, through our stories that we share. Okay? And so what we're seeing, using Instagram as one of our tools, social media, we put up these photos of individuals, Latinos, in the outdoors, a diversity of Latino individuals, whether they're already passionate outdoor enthusiasts or whether they are first-time families connecting to nature. And of course, that resonates with people. Wow, how did you do that? Where is that? When can we go? Or this was this family, we don't like going out in nature because it's scary. But if they're doing it, how do we start that? Right? So it matters because we want to use diversity of communities as a strength, just like you see diversity as a strength in nature. So, we don't say that's a beautiful monoculture of a forest, right? Unless you're harvesting just for timber, maybe, or it's a Christmas tree farm. But that's not when we look at, when we value ecological diversity, how is that represented, obviously, in community diversity? So that's where the entry point into diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, this isn't a diversity, equity, and inclusion training workshop. That requires different work. But this should get you to start thinking about why this matters to address some of those points that Cindy put up at the beginning. So with this question of a racial divide, right? Yes, accept that race is a social construct. So this isn't a question of whether, it's social construct, so it doesn't matter. Because it's a social construct, it definitely matters because it still guides interactions in communities. You still have communities respond in different ways. Okay? And I think many of you have seen this image before, right? When we say, what's the difference between equality or equity? Well, we're all equal here, right? Now you can try to set it up to have equality of opportunities. That's not the same as being equitable in terms of what's fair, because for equity work, you have to start looking at privilege. What can I, as a Latino male, do that a Latina cannot do? What does that look like with our families and communities? What can a Caucasian male do that I cannot do because of our lived experience? Right? How will I be treated by a police officer or a park ranger different than how you might be treated? Right? And it's important to connect with each other because you may just assume that your interactions is what's normal for everybody. And so you think there's no problem. I'm treated just fine. Right? So that's what I mean about it's uncomfortable, but that's where you dig into the equity work, because then you have to look at it's not an even starting point. So how can we make sure we address all of the obstacles and barriers that another community individual has? And when we look at diversity, equality, and this is why I put here equity and equality, because a lot of times you'll see it as equality, and I'm saying, well, dig a little deeper. Look into equity, because it's not just about what's fair, what's equal, but what's needed to be fair. And so diversity means we just get more people here. That's the starting point. Let's get more stories out there. But equity is about then saying, when they're here, do they have what they need? Are you also providing a community with the things that matter to them? Right? This is where a lot of you have done great work with fruit trees. You know that fruit trees are valued because they're an additional, they provide food for a family that may not have that same access to the Trader Joe's or the Whole Foods or all the organic food that we keep telling them is so important. Why don't you buy it? right? Because, well, can't afford it. We know it's good for us. Our families are maybe the ones picking that food. That doesn't mean we have the paycheck. Right? And then inclusion is once you have, even within staff, so once they're in with you, do they stay? And why don't they stay? And do you know that? Because even now we tend to lose a lot of Latino professionals in the field because they feel that their voices are not heard, valued, the changes they're trying to push within an organization don't go anywhere. So I might as well go back to community organizing for housing or to being an immigration advocate because my voice counts a lot there. So how's my voice actually mattering in my organization and in the movement for this work? Right. So we'll be coming close to time. There's going to be time for a lot of questions at the end. But I'm going to close with a few examples of then, what does this look like in the storytelling that we do? So chicalote, which is a poppy, I can go onto the USDA database and get all this awesome information, right? But I am not going to, this is not what I'm going to start off with when I take a family out hiking, right? All right, everyone gather around. So, okay, this is really important. Okay, this is Argemone Mexicana Linnaeus, and you have, the way that you know you're looking at it is because the stems often branch from the base, and they have da-da-da, right? I could get excited about that. But if I listen and think about how when I go hiking with my uncle down in Nayarit, the framing of human object, whereas this is the plant and this is what it, this is what it is and this is how you identify it and how it's classified, is different than if my uncle, when he tells me this is what we call it, community value, livelihood connections, and this is what it's used for, right? And in many cases, medicinal purposes, or just the community has found some value for that plant. Okay. Now, it may not always be accurate or correct information scientifically, but you can't be dismissive of it. You have to listen and learn and ask questions because then they feel engaged, and then you begin the conversation to introduce information that may need to be corrected. But that's because they actually trust you and care about what's being shared, rather than just like, no, you're wrong. Right? That's how we shut people out. So this is why when we talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not just about diversity, we just get more of it. Let's just translate it into Spanish. So this is what Bobby mentioned yesterday. Is it still culturally relevant? I mean, am I basically just saying I'm taking your story and just switching it into Spanish? Well, that's not my story. So the information that we're presenting, if we're just switching the words, that community might still not have a relationship to what you're talking about. So is it inclusive then of the stories and the relationships that the community has to nature? Right? Because otherwise we're just swapping words. So it's not just a matter of direct translation. This is why with the work that we're doing with our storytelling work through Latino Outdoors is we're calling it conservation cultura. How do we weave the culture into the conservation work? And how can that look different? You might think radically different, but not radically different if we're looking at what's culturally important in a community. And to even stress further the point, I use culturaleza, which is a combination of the Spanish words cultura and naturaleza, culture and nature, to even represent how we're mestizos, meaning that we come from different cultures, ambicultural roots. So I'm even exemplifying in the word itself. And so one of the ways, the last example I'll share with you is that we do this, I do this through artwork. Right? So if I want to talk about recycling, you all can all recognize the recycling sign, right? And you're thinking, okay, I get it, there's some recycling stuff going on here. But there's a story in here. First of all, is I'm using artwork because that will resonate, right? And people see like, oh cool, this looks like the Aztec codices and whatnot. So I can just look at it and it looks interesting. But then I can talk about what do you see, what do you notice? Why is he recycling? Well, how's that important to you? Well, economically, it's because we just collect cans. I mean, my parents still collect cans. Well, did you also know that the Mexica were a zero waste society? Right? Let's look at that. You have roots in conservation, deeper than the work that's happening now. we talk about the water cycle, similar description. Now this could just stand on its own as a, water is life, let's take care of it. But let's unpack that. What does that look like? And so this is where we'll engage with an audience or community and tell me, what do you see? What is this little guy? Why is he there? And it's interesting just to hear then from the community what they're sharing. And that includes not just visuals, but the phrases, the cultural markers, like si se puede. You probably hear si se puede in like so many different contexts for our favorite soccer game, for whatever it might be. It resonates as a way to say we can do it, it's possible, we will overcome, because it taps into a community story of being an underdog, or like knowing you have a lot of different challenges to go through. Right? But when we compare that to sequoias, take the tiny little seed of a sequoia, and it becomes this huge tree, and we look at it, it's like, look at that, si se puede, right? And everyone laughs about it, has a good time, but it's like, now we're connecting to this, like, so how does that happen? And then we can, when we're talking with students about this, we can say, how are you like a sequoia? What's your si se puede moment like a sequoia? How are you becoming this little seed to this giant tree? Okay? So I'll close by sharing these last two examples of how, with communities, we talked about the diversity of stories and diversity of communities. There's a spectrum of engagement, and a lot of times it's easy to work with those that already get it, and that's good. They can help a lot, but we don't want to overburden this group or community, because if you're really going to make systemic change, diversity is about it being intentional and institutionalized. That requires a lot of time. You got to put the hard work about really understanding why some communities are just not engaged. And that requires some changes with you. Okay? And we can, like I said, this will all be available. We'll have more opportunities to talk about it. So I will close by saying, identify your story, unpack the language. Don't expect communities to intuitively come to you, just as Cindy mentioned. Be okay when their story is different, and they might just need to sit with a tree for healing. You know this, right? But before you drop all of the needed information, allow for that opportunity to connect and for you to hear, how does this matter to them? And you can still provide all the technical expertise that's needed. This is actually working together, right? Because they won't have the workshops that you can provide, but you also don't have the cultural relevancy that they can help you with, okay? So I'll close by showing you that this is how we're visually showing the diversity of the Latino experience in relation with nature, conservation, and the outdoors. And we're doing this through outings, trainings, and of course storytelling, so that when people ask, how do Latinos connect with nature and the outdoors? I don't have to just tell them. I can say the community is helping us show everybody, right? So with that, I'll say this real quickly, the picture. I put on a skirt hiking because it's important to challenge some of the males in our group to think about how, if you're going to talk about leadership, it doesn't matter what you're wearing, right? And that gender plays a role. And so I did this to show, like, put on the skirt. And it convinced a fellow member who was really uncomfortable with it to say, okay, I'll try it. And as he's walking down the trail, this Boy Scout troop is coming up. And the boys, a couple of the Boy Scouts like, wow, what is that? And what I had done with the skirt, I said, well, this is a leadership, skirt. And it allows me to, like, even better unpack, like, da-da-da. And I heard him say the same things to the Boy Scouts. And I thought, that's what I mean. You engage, and you have to be a model for this as well, rather than saying, well, it's a skirt. I'm not going to wear a skirt, right? So it's a leadership skirt, just an outdoor leadership skirt. All right, so I'll close there for some questions. As we always say, si se puede. If you don't know Dolores Huerta, make sure you look her up. But this is what we now need to do. Pero hazlo. We got to do it. And Melissa's keeping us on track, I think.
Jose, that's great. And I want to ask a question because I'm very interested in stories associated with plants as well. And from somebody who writes natural history books, I go into previous books and I try to find what stories are there out there about these plants, the poppy or whatever. It can be used by humans for this and that. And when you start to look into it a little closer, it's like what you said, scientifically inaccurate. Mm-hmm. And I want to be able to tell those stories. And I want to know how you resolve that idea that you can use it for this, or you can do this with this plant, or people do this, and they have for a long time, but the actual information is not very good there, or it's a story. And so I want to hear your resolution for that, because I grapple with that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and you need to be honest. If you're doing the work, as often as said, right? If it's hard, if it's not hard, then you're probably not doing it right. So a couple of the ways that I do that, so I'll give you two quick examples. We took this group of families out to the Palo Alto Baylands just to have them go check it out. And one of the ways we first is like listen to the stories. We saw a turkey vulture. And so I asked them, look at that. Like, what do you see? What is it? And the cool thing is his dad gave me like all 4 different Spanish words for a vulture. And I was like, oh, cool, I forgot about that one, right? So that begins the inclusion piece. We're already diverse because we got them out there. We're already helping them, having it be equitable, because we asked, what are your transportation needs or barriers? And they could tell us, we're okay, we know how to get there, we need to make it, we just need for you to tell us what time and your phone number in case we get lost. Right? The inclusion part is then, cool, well, tell me about that. And I got this beautiful story that went beyond the turkey vulture, and he told me about how his grandparents in post-revolutionary Mexico used turkey vultures as an indicator for law enforcement, because if you saw a bunch of them, it means that residents took law into their own hands and hung the bandits. I'm just here listening. It's amazing, right? But we closed it then with like, well, so then how do you identify? How do you know that this is this kind of bird? And they were already hooked in, and then, so what I say, it's like, well, that is amazing and fascinating. Like, this is how I identify it. I'd like to share it with you, and here's why. And that's why I've woven in the part of saying, actually, I think that's a different type of plant, or it could be used for that. Now, if we did a study for it, we don't really know, but I'm really glad you shared it, because now I'm interested in finding out more. So we tried to, I didn't have it up here about how to engage their cognitive map, right? And if you need to engage the cognitive map, you first have to look at where they are. So we were looking at fennel as well. And a couple of them had misidentified, I forget what it was, something different. And I said, well, actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to show you how the people that come here and manage it, how they identify it, and what they call it, and so forth. And they like that, because they don't like to be giving inaccurate or wrong information. But it came from a point for them, like, first sharing where they're coming from. And I know this is where the messenger matters a lot. But if once you build those initial trust and relationship, they're open to it. So, I support the work that you're doing. And so I would just add then, yeah, continue to do it, please. Okay, I was going to say, whoever has the mic, go for it.
I just wanted to thank you for your great presentation. I wanted to speak to that just very briefly about, whose comment was it, about it was yours, like the, information, when people are telling their stories, I spoke with you briefly last night, I teach medicinal plant uses as part of the education that I do, and I have done bilingual hikes. And so, as far as, correcting people in the way, that you were describing, if there is inaccurate information, I thought that was really good, the example you gave. It's really gracious, to say, well, yeah, it does look similar to that plant. Like, I've had something, there's a native plant that grows here in Southern California, our coastal sagebrush. And people say, oh, it looks like rosemary, right? It's rosemary. And say, well, you know what? That's very interesting, because when the Spanish first came here, that's what they called it, because it looked like rosemary. This is actually our sagebrush, And so it's like, oh, okay, but, so it doesn't invalidate people, because then it's like, oh, well, historically people thought that. And so it's a good, gracious way to do that. But then also, I wouldn't necessarily discount some of the traditional uses that people use for plants, because there's a really great book. It's called Healing with Medicinal Plants of the West, and it's great because it was written by a Chumash medicine woman who is I learned from, but also Jim Adams, who's a professor of pharmacology at USC. And what he did is that he learned according to the tradition, but he took these plants into his lab at USC and broke them down according to 12, 13,000 years of use in California, and actually realized that, hey, all these active compounds, it scientifically, and you had that great chart showing how different cultures view things, right? So it really broke it down for our Western mindsets that, wow, aspirin is derived from it's from salicin, which is in the willow bark. It's concentrated in willow bark. So people have been using willow trees for that purpose for thousands of years worldwide. And so I've learned also taking Latinos out bilingual hikes, they'll have uses for these plants, and I wouldn't necessarily say that they might not scientifically withstand a test like that. So I think it's a very valuable way to engage those communities, and I'd like to thank you for telling us all about that.
No, of course, thank you. Yerba buena es yerba buena, no matter where. Who has the mic, I think, over there? And I realize we may run out of time, but I'm here until tomorrow, so I'm not here at the podium, but right?
Thanks. I just wanted to say I've had so much fun. Like, I deliberately 12 years ago decided to go to a predominantly Latino area of LA County, and I don't speak Spanish. I'm a mom, so I speak mom. And what's really been fun is sharing and getting to know different worldview, different points of connection. And what I'd love to see maybe in the next few years is mixtures of kids. Instead of seeing just the Latino or just the Asian or just the white, we need to really enjoy all of our backgrounds and histories, and really start to work with kids very, very young and get their wonderful minds creatively looking at nature. So I just wanted to say I really love what you're doing and love to share what we've been doing, and make sure that we stop segmenting ourselves by culture, but really enjoy each other.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I also really love the work that Amigos de los Rios does. I want to say that's a great point. What we look at for this, because one of the comments or concerns that comes is like Latino outdoors are just by and for Latinos. I'm like, no, but that unpacks, the perception that we have. And I said, all of our outings are open for everybody. I said, but when we talk about this, getting to this diverse conservation table, right? This is where I talk about the equity and inclusion part. What are all the ways that all of us can get there? Because that's our goal, right? And so how are we providing connecting opportunities for communities that, for whatever reason, have not felt welcome or haven't felt they had that? And so we really look at, as a great point, as both the inter and the intra community building, because we know that once we develop a strong sense of community, then we can engage this community with another community, because that's what I told them, we all have work to do. Right? There's prejudices within the Latino community itself about how they perceive other communities, but there's also a lot of great examples and opportunities of how we work together. So this is where unpacking some of that complexity matters. And then when we say, if we're going to engage Latinos, that's a loaded statement. And so we need to look at which community and in what way, and what are the community history and stories, and how have they been engaged with other communities, and how can we facilitate that. So great example.
Jose, what is your nickname when you're out with the kids?
My nickname? You mean is that like a camp name?
Yeah, your camp name, your nickname. What do they call you?
Great question. That was totally new to me. I never got a naturalist name. I was like, naturalist name, what's that? But I've been everywhere from, well, actually, let me step back. My social media handle is Green Chicano. So, but I've also been Papa Bear for the kids. Great question, CH. Green_Chicano. You can find us. So I'll say that. So you can look up Latino Outdoors on Instagram, on Twitter, and on Facebook. We probably might be following some of you. Or you can follow us and check out those examples. The community that we're looking to build and support is meant to be a resource for everybody. So I'll even, if you don't mind, Claire, I'll put an excellent example. You have Brenda, right? So we consider Brenda kind of part of our community at large. We don't take ownership, obviously, of what she does or work that she needs. So we want to be able to say, in the work that she does with Amigos de los Rios, can we be a resource because you're doing fantastic stuff? So that's how we're really trying to stress to elevate the whole community, because these ambicultural leaders were here, and we want to say we want to stay here. Two? Okay, we got 2 more, and that's it? Okay.
So I have a kind of comment. I came to Tree People originally in our work wanting to go to the communities that didn't come to us first. And we're fortunate enough to be able to spend 6 years with 3 or 4 staff members doing trial and error. And I love that thought of learning forward, because that's really what it's been, is learning through making mistakes and having successes and learning how to listen. And I think that the challenge for tree planting somewhat is making an additional bridge. We've learned, and you and I were talking this morning about making the connection with the community, slowing down, listening to the stories, and then connecting, but that takes time. And so the additional bridge that I think is our current challenge is the bridge to different funders and foundations and businesses that may want to put money into tree work are looking, and I loved Cindy's comment about outputs versus outcomes. A lot of them are still looking at the output of how many trees are you putting in the ground? What are those numbers? When we need them to understand better the outcome of, I may be only putting in 20 trees in this community, but I've changed the perception entirely by taking the time to listen and share with them. And so I think that's, and any tips you can give on bridging that piece to communicating to the people who fund the work that we do, around the fact that this takes more time, I'm happy to.
And I've been pushing for the past year just so that you know exactly on that point of how to fund community building and relationship building if you're actually going to have the transformative work that people keep asking about. It's a great point. So just know I am doing that. Think we had last comment or?
We struggled a while back trying to translate information into Spanish, because we learned there are different words for clay and silt and things like that. And then we struggled because every translator we went to had a different, it was from a different part of South America, I guess you could say. So they had a different, version of Spanish. And we ended up putting it in like high Spanish. And so what would you recommend? And then after we did this and spent the money on the publication, and we would go to like Fiesta de la Familia and cultural events and put out our literature, we were kind of shocked because most of the people there were picking up the English version. And we felt like, wow, did we waste our energy and our money, printing in high Spanish, or, so what would you recommend?
That's going to go back to the first level of understanding what is the community in your area. It might begin by you just looking at the census. So in the Bay Area, actually, the Mercury News has this beautiful map from the 2010 census that breaks down, like if I look at Palo Alto, what does Latino mean in Palo Alto? Is it predominantly Central American, and from where, right? So that's one piece, because obviously that's something that I pay attention to. My heritage is Mexican. So when we engage with like the Salvadorian community, right, I go in learning as well. But I also am connected to allies, like park rangers who are from El Salvador, that we have that conversation. And then the second piece I was going to say goes back to the need of language. That's understanding the community as well. You may not need Spanish, and that's okay. It might be bilingual or just English only, and that's going to be accepted. So you need to do that. Or if, depending on the community you're working with, kind of innovative, then you do some code switching or Spanglish. And that can resonate really well, especially with some of the terms. Even my mom, I said, so do you say vamos a acampar, or do you prefer vamos camping? And she said, no, vamos camping, right? Because for her, that code switching makes sense now. And that may be another inclusive practice, again, depending on the community you're working with. And you'll have a company like Ford that's actually doing that very successfully. I listen to their ads on the radio, and it's like I started listening, and I'm like, wait, it was just both in English and in Spanish combined. It wasn't a direct translation. and that's engaging a new demographic right there as well.
All right, no more questions?
Thank you so much.